I still remember that morning like it's burned into my skull. The sun hadn't fully climbed above the rooftops yet, but our house was already buzzing with noise, laughter, clinking dishes, the low hum of the heater trying to fight off the chill. I could smell the faint sweetness of vanilla and chocolate wafting from the kitchen where Mom was meticulously icing the cake. Frosting smudged on her fingers like evidence of a secret she didn't want me to see. That I was excited. Yeah, but there was this strange knot in my stomach too. You know that feeling? The one where you're looking forward to something, but your chest feels tight and heavy at the same time. I shrugged it off at first, telling myself, it's just a birthday. Grandpa loves birthdays. Everything will be fine. Grandpa was all ready. Then when I walked into the living room, sitting at the head of the long dining table, he had this way of filling a room without even moving. The scent of his aftershave, something musky, like old leather and cedar, lingered in the air. His eyes, sharp as winter frost, scanned the room as if he was sizing up every single person, every little smile, every little mistake that I tried to act casual. I really did. I laughed at jokes that weren't funny, smiled at relatives I barely recognized. I brought him the gift I had agonized over for weeks, a small leather-bound notebook, hoping he'd like it, hoping he'd see that I cared. That he didn't look at it. Not really. He just took it, nodded, and said something about useful things without so much as a smile. I remember forcing a smile back, trying to meet his eyes, and seeing nothing. But nothing. And then it happened. The words landed like a punch to my gut. He looked at me. The entire room seemed to fall silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall, and he said, "This place isn't for losers. You don't belong here." I froze. My hand was still half extended, holding the notebook like a lifeline that had just been cut. I think the air left my lungs in that moment. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and uneven, echoing in my ears. The warmth of the cake, the laughter, the smell of candle smoke, it all turned cold, distant, meaningless. Everyone else pretended nothing happened. They smiled, they clapped, they told Grandpa happy birthday, as if he hadn't just shattered. Me. I wanted to disappear, to sink into the floorboards and let the room swallow me whole. But I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at him, trying desperately to understand if I'd heard him wrong, if maybe I had imagined it. But I hadn't. I hadn't. That moment didn't just break my heart. It cracked something deeper, something I didn't even know was fragile until it was gone. And in that room, full of noise and warmth and celebration, I realized the person I thought I could rely on most had decided I didn't deserve to be there. That single word, it haunted me long after the party ended. Loser. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't a joke. It was delivered quietly, almost casually, but it hit like a hammer. I kept hearing it in the silence of my room that night, bouncing around in my head like a song I couldn't escape. Loser. 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 I sat on my bed, staring at the ceiling, tracing cracks that didn't exist before. I wanted to scrub it from my memory, but it clung like a shadow. I could still feel the weight of his eyes, sharp and assessing, cutting through me. Even now, thinking back, I remember the way my fingers shook while I held the notebook I'd given him, how the paper felt too heavy in my hands, as if it had absorbed all the rejection in the room. Walking outside helped, at least for a while. I wandered down the empty street, the cold night air stinging my cheeks, the asphalt slick with the memory of a day I'd hoped would be happy. Streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, uneven shadows that seemed to follow me. Every laugh from a passing car, every bark of a dog in the distance, felt like it belonged to someone else, someone whose life hadn't just been ripped open by a single word that I tried to make sense of it. I really did. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he didn't mean it. But no matter how many times I said it to myself, the word sank deeper. Loser. It stuck to me, like a coat I couldn't take off. And then, in the quiet moments, brushing my teeth, washing dishes, staring at the reflection in the bathroom mirror, it hit me. This word wasn't just an insult. It was a verdict, a label. Something Grandpa had decided, in that split second, was who I was. And somehow, somewhere in me, I started to believe it. I tried to laugh it off later, joking with my friends over the phone. Grandpa thinks I'm a loser, I said, forcing a chuckle. But even in that laughter, there was an edge of vulnerability I couldn't hide. I wanted someone to tell me it wasn't true, to tell me I wasn't broken, that the person I saw in the mirror was okay. But no one said that. And in that silence, I started asking myself questions I didn't want to answer. Am I really a loser? Is this my fault? I could feel my pride shrinking until it was almost gone. That night, lying under my blanket with the faint smell of birthday cake still clinging to my clothes, I made a silent promise to myself. I'd figure it out. I'd prove him wrong. But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the sting of the words. They had found a way in, and they weren't going anywhere anytime soon. The thing about words like that, they aren't just spoken. They echo. They echo in every corner of your life, in every thought, every hesitation, every moment you try to stand tall. And I would spend months, maybe years, chasing the shadow of loser that had been pressed onto me that day. Sometimes, when the memory of that birthday gnaws at me, I go back in my mind to a different time, a time when Grandpa wasn't a judge, when his words didn't carry the weight of a verdict. I can still see it so clearly, as if the scenes are playing on a dusty old projector in my head. I remember the summer afternoons we spent at the lake. The sun would hang low in the sky, turning the water into molten gold. Grandpa would teach me to fish, his hands steady and sure as he showed me how to bait the hook, how to cast the line. I remember his laugh then, deep, hearty, and warm, and the way it made my small victories feel monumental. Look, I caught one, I'd shout, and he'd clap his hands, eyes twinkling. He'd let me reel in the fish, letting me feel proud, letting me feel like I mattered. Bedtime stories were another world entirely. I'd crawl into his big, worn armchair, the leather cracked from years of use, and he'd spin tales of heroes and misfits, of daring adventures and quiet victories. Sometimes I'd fall asleep halfway through, his voice wrapping around me like a protective blanket. In those moments, the world felt simple, safe, full of possibility, and now those memories cut deep. I realized the same hands that once guided me, that once praised me, could also condemn me. The same voice that once told me I was capable of great things could also label me a loser. It's jarring, the way love and cruelty can inhabit the same person. I keep wondering, did he always have this capacity to wound me? Or did the man I loved and trusted just change? I try to reconcile the past with the present. I replay our small, quiet moments, holding hands while walking home from school, sharing a slice of his famous apple pie, the smell of his pipe smoke mixing with the scent of autumn leaves. Those moments feel sacred, yet they're now tinged with bitterness. It's like holding a beautiful photograph that's been scratched and smudged. You want to treasure it, but the damage is impossible to ignore. And sometimes, in the stillness of my room, I whisper to myself, was I blind to who he really was? Or was I just too young to see the cracks forming beneath the surface? Flashbacks have a cruel way of teaching you lessons you weren't ready for. They remind you that people are complicated, that love is messy, and that the same person who shaped your sense of self can also shake it to its very core. And as I sit with these memories, I can feel both gratitude and grief mingling inside me. Grateful for the warmth I once knew, grieving the pain that would come later, the betrayal that would cut deeper than any wound before that I left the house that night. Without a word, the party behind me was still alive with laughter, music, and the smell of burnt candles, but it felt like I was stepping into a different world, a world that belonged only to me and the silence that followed me like a shadow. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flickering street lamp casting long, uneven shadows. The cold air bit at my cheeks and made my breath visible, curling into little clouds that disappeared before I could even focus on them. Each step I took seemed louder than the last, my shoes crunching against gravel and broken pavement, a sound that felt too real in the stillness. I wanted to cry, to scream, to shake the air itself and demand answers, but my body refused. It had gone numb. Every street corner, every flicker of light reminded me of the party, the cake, the family, the laughter, and yet none of it felt like mine anymore. Grandpa's words echoed in my mind, bouncing around with every heartbeat. This place isn't for losers. You don't belong here. I could almost hear the way he had enunciated each word, slow and deliberate, like he wanted them to sink into me and never leave. That I passed by houses that were warm and alive inside, lights glowing in windows, families eating together, sharing stories, arguing over trivial things. And I thought, bitterly. Why do they get to feel safe? Why do they get to belong? I remember stopping under a lamppost that flickered as if struggling to hold its light, leaning against the cold metal, and realizing how heavy my chest had become. It wasn't just sadness, it was a kind of hollow ache, like my lungs weren't filling properly, like my heart was both too big and too empty at the same time. I wanted someone, anyone, to notice, to care, to tell me it wasn't true. But the night had no one but me that I started replaying every little interaction I'd had that day, every small moment of hope, every forced smile. The cake, the candles, the notebook I had given Grandpa, all of it felt meaningless now. The warmth of family, the joy of celebration, had been replaced with a bitter, cold understanding that sometimes the people you think will protect you the most are the ones who hurt you deepest, and yet, even in that silence, even in that cold and isolation, there was a small, stubborn flicker inside me. Something whispered, almost too quiet to hear, "You're not defined by him. You're not a loser unless you let him decide it." That I didn't know if I believed it yet. But I knew one thing. That night, as I walked the empty streets, I started to understand that the world could be cruel. And sometimes, survival meant learning to carry that cruelty without breaking. The nights after that birthday were the hardest. Sleep used to be a refuge for me, a place where the day's worries faded, and I could dream freely. But now, sleep became another battlefield. Grandpa's words played on an endless loop in my mind, like a broken record I couldn't stop. "Loser, you don't belong here. Loser." Every phrase wound itself tighter around my chest, squeezing, suffocating, leaving me restless in the dark. That I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, the soft glow of the streetlight through the blinds casting stripes across my face. The familiar hum of the city outside, cars passing, distant laughter, a dog barking, felt intrusive, almost mocking. Even the silence of my room seemed to judge me. My own thoughts became enemies, whispering doubts I had never entertained before. Was I really a disappointment? Had I failed without knowing it? Maybe he's right. Maybe I am a loser that I tried to distract myself with little rituals. I'd scroll my phone, hoping for a friend's message, a distraction, anything to break the loop. But the screen's cold. Blue glow made the room feel emptier, and even the laughter of people on social media seemed like a distant, unreachable world, one I didn't belong in. I started noticing little things, the way my pillows smelled, the stiffness of the sheets, the faint creak in the floorboards when the house settled. Everything felt amplified, as if the universe had conspired to remind me of how small and insignificant I suddenly felt. Flashbacks would strike unexpectedly, too. I'd remember the way Grandpa used to ruffle my hair as a kid, the warmth of his hand on my shoulder, the glow of the fireplace when he told me stories. Those moments felt like cruel trickery now, proof of a love that had shifted, leaving me in the cold. I'd see his eyes, sharp and unyielding, dissecting me, judging me, and I would shiver under the weight of it. I began lying awake for hours, replaying that birthday over and over, examining every gesture, every word, trying to find some clue I had missed. Was there something I could have said? Something I should have done differently? But no answer came. Just the same echo, loser, and slowly, night after night, it began to shape me. Not entirely, not completely, but enough that I questioned every small action, a misstep at school, a forgotten homework assignment, a clumsy joke. Everything seemed like proof, a tiny validation of that word, that judgment, that sentence that had changed how I saw myself. Sometimes, in the very early hours, when the world was quiet and still, I'd whisper to myself, maybe I'm not. Maybe I can still prove him wrong. It was a faint, fragile thought, barely there. But it was the first spark that would one day grow into something stronger. The beginning of a fight I hadn't yet realized I had to fight. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself obsessively searching for answers. Why did he say that? Was it really about me, or something else entirely? The questions never stopped. I kept going over every interaction, every conversation we'd ever had, trying to uncover some hidden logic behind the cruelty that I started thinking about Grandpa's life. The man behind the sharp voice and piercing eyes. He'd grown up during times I could barely imagine, tough and unforgiving, shaped by a world that demanded strength above all else. I thought about the sacrifices he must have made, the mistakes he may have carried silently, the pride he clung to like armor. Could it be that his words weren't about me at all, but about the part of him that feared weakness, feared failure? At school, I began noticing patterns in his behavior. He wasn't cruel to everyone. He could be warm, even funny, with people he deemed capable. Maybe he thought he was teaching me a lesson, forcing me to toughen up. Maybe, just maybe, he thought this rejection would motivate me to prove myself. But even if that were true, it didn't make it hurt any less. The lesson felt like a punishment, and the punishment felt like a verdict I didn't ask for. I found myself flipping through old family albums, watching images of him as a young man, proud, confident, unyielding. I saw my own reflection in him, traits I had inherited, the stubbornness, the curiosity, the hunger for recognition. And yet, somehow, those traits were never enough in his eyes. I started wondering if I'd ever be enough, if anything I did could ever meet the impossible standard he had set. The search for reasons became an obsession. I'd sit in my room, scribbling notes, making timelines, dissecting conversations like a detective hunting for clues. I wanted to understand him, to understand why the man I had once adored could break me so completely. But understanding didn't bring relief. It just made the absence of love, the gap between us, feel heavier. And in those quiet hours, I realized something painful. Maybe some things don't have a reason that makes sense. Maybe people hurt you because of their own fears, their own regrets, their own inability to love fully. Maybe I wouldn't get closure from him. Maybe I would have to find it somewhere else, within myself. Even as I searched, I couldn't shake the anger bubbling under the surface, the frustration at being labeled, at being judged, at being dismissed. And yet, deep down, there was also a flicker of understanding, fragile and fleeting, that maybe his cruelty was not entirely personal, that maybe it was the echo of his own pain. I didn't have answers, but I had questions. And for the first time since that birthday, that felt like the beginning of something, a chance to make sense of the chaos, or at least to survive it. That I didn't see it coming. Not exactly. The anger had been simmering, quietly, a low, dull ache beneath the surface of everything I did. But one night, it erupted, raw, uncontrollable, and entirely unstoppable. It started small. A casual comment at school, someone joking about losers, and it hit me like a match to dry tinder. My hands trembled, my chest tightened, and for the first time in months, I let the floodgates open. I screamed into my pillow, the sound muffled but powerful, as if I could throw every ounce of frustration, every lingering doubt, into that small, helpless bundle of fabric. That I remember pacing my room, kicking chairs, slamming drawers, the house echoing with my fury. I cried, too. Ugly, desperate crying that felt like it might never end. Anger and grief tangled together so tightly, I didn't know where one began and the other ended. I felt betrayed, abandoned, and profoundly small all at once. I wanted to call him, confront him, demand answers, but my voice was gone, or maybe it had been trapped in my throat for too long. I could see his face clearly, that cold, unyielding expression from my birthday. I could hear the words again, precise and cruel. This place isn't for losers. They weren't just words anymore. They were a verdict that had haunted me, following me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I wanted to destroy that shadow. I wanted to scream back into the world that I wasn't what he said I was. I ran outside. The air was sharp and biting, slicing through the tears on my cheeks. I walked aimlessly, feeling every ounce of grief and rage pulse in my legs and arms. I passed streetlights that flickered, empty sidewalks that seemed to stretch endlessly, and I realized something terrifying. I couldn't run from this feeling. I couldn't escape the truth of how deeply I had been wounded. And yet, amid all the chaos, a strange clarity emerged. The anger wasn't just pain anymore. It was fuel. It was proof that I cared, that I had been broken because I had dared to hope. And for the first time, I allowed myself to feel it fully, without shame. I let the storm rage through me, knowing that after it passed, I might feel lighter, or at least, I might begin to heal. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't calm down, but something shifted inside me. I understood that this moment, raw, painful, and unrelenting, was necessary. It was the tipping point, the breaking point. And from here, I would either let it destroy me completely, or I would begin the long, slow work of reclaiming myself. the days after the breaking point were quiet, almost painfully so. The storm had passed, leaving a hollow space inside me that felt simultaneously empty and strangely full of possibility, if I could only reach for it. I didn't have answers, and I didn't have closure. What I did have for the first time in months was a choice: to let Grandpa's words define me, or to start carving my own path. That I started small. I began journaling, scribbling my thoughts onto paper in messy, jagged handwriting. I wrote about the birthday, about his words, about the anger and heartbreak that had gripped me so tightly. Writing didn't make the pain vanish, but it gave it shape. It made it something I could hold, something I could examine, instead of a constant, amorphous weight in my chest that I threw myself into little victories. A perfect score on a test I had worried about for weeks. Finishing a book I had started but abandoned too many times. Helping a friend in a way that made me feel needed. Every small accomplishment became a brick in the rebuilding of who I was, a counterweight to the word loser that had been etched into my mind. That I also learned to lean on others. I found friends who listened without judgment, who didn't need me to be perfect to care. Their voices, soft and supportive, began to drown out the echoes of Grandpa's criticism. I started realizing that love and validation could exist outside the walls of that house, outside the reach of someone who had once held so much power over me. Some days were harder than others. I still felt the pangs of anger and doubt creep in, uninvited, when I least expected them. But gradually, I began to see that those moments didn't define me. They were reminders that healing is messy, that progress is never linear. And little by little, I started to trust myself again. That I remember one evening, sitting by my window, watching the rain streak down the glass, thinking, I am not a loser. I am not defined by a word, by a judgment, by someone else's fear of weakness. And in that moment, I felt a flicker of peace, fragile, tentative, but real. I knew the road ahead would still be long, but for the first time, I believed that I could walk it on my own terms. The rebuilding wasn't just about proving Grandpa wrong. It was about proving to myself that I could survive, that I could grow, and that I could reclaim every piece of me that had been crushed by those words. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly moving forward. Years had passed since that birthday, years filled with quiet victories, small successes, and a slow reclaiming of myself. And yet, something kept pulling me back. A mixture of curiosity, unresolved tension, and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, some part of Grandpa had softened with time. When I walked up to the old house again, it felt smaller than I remembered. The paint faded, the porch creaking beneath my feet. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust, and the faint scent of pipe smoke seemed to linger in corners where time had settled. Grandpa was older now, his once sharp eyes softer, though still wary, and his posture a little more stooped. The room felt heavy, filled with memories and unspoken words, but I stepped inside anyway. We didn't speak much at first. Silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable, like a rope I didn't know how to untie. I studied him, searching for any trace of the man I had known as a child, and for the man who had wounded me so deeply. I saw glimpses in his hands, gnarled and trembling slightly as he poured tea, in the faint tremor of his voice as he muttered something about the weather. A lifetime of experience and regret seemed to hang in the air. That I realized then that I didn't need his approval anymore. I didn't need him to say I was worthy, or smart, or capable. I had built my life, my confidence, my identity, not because he had sanctioned it, but in spite of him. And that knowledge carried a quiet, powerful weight. That we talked in fragments. Pieces of conversation that felt both awkward and familiar. He asked about my work, my friends, the small victories I had quietly accumulated over the years. I answered politely, keeping the storm of old emotions at bay, and I noticed something. He didn't scold me. He didn't belittle me. He simply existed, and I existed alongside him, no longer shrinking, no longer hiding. For the first time, I understood something crucial. Closure doesn't always come from apologies or explanations or even forgiveness. Sometimes, closure is the act of showing up in your own life fully, intact, despite the cracks others tried to impose. And as I left that house that day, stepping back onto the familiar street, the late afternoon sun warm on my face, I felt a lightness I hadn't known in years. I had survived the shadow of those words. I had survived him. And somehow, that was enough that I used to carry that word everywhere, like a stone in my pocket I couldn't take out. Loser. It had clung to me, whispered, in the quiet moments, laughed at me in the crowded ones, and made me question every step I took. But over the years, I've learned that a word is only as powerful as the meaning you give it. And I've chosen to rewrite that meaning. Being called a loser by someone else, even by grandpa, even by someone I loved and trusted, does not define my worth. I've realized that losing, in their terms, isn't about failure. It's about not conforming, about not fitting someone else's narrow idea of success. And if that's what it means to be a loser, then I'll take it. Because losing in their eyes gave me the chance to win in my own. I think about all the nights I spent replaying his words, the walks under empty streetlights, the anger, the tears. I think about the way I clawed myself back, brick by brick, rewriting my own story when no one else could. And I smile, not with arrogance, not with malice, but with quiet, calm triumph. I survived. I grew. I became someone I can respect. There's a strange peace in walking away from the shadow of someone else's judgment. It doesn't erase the past, and it doesn't make the pain vanish, but it does give you control over your own narrative. I've learned to embrace the word, twist it, own it in a way that fuels me rather than breaks me. So yes, maybe Grandpa thought this place wasn't for me. Maybe he thought I didn't belong, that I was unworthy, that I was weak. But this world, my life, isn't defined by him or his standards. This place is for me. I built it. I fought for it. And I'll keep building it on my own terms every day. And when I look in the mirror now, I don't see a loser. I see someone who's faced rejection, heartbreak, and cruelty and survived. Someone who's taken pain and turned it into purpose. Someone who knows that belonging doesn't come from being chosen by others. It comes from choosing yourself. So if you ever find yourself called a loser by someone who should have lifted you up, remember this: the word only has power if you let it. And you get to decide what it really means.